Hey, it's Hammer Time.
A very special episode of Hammer Time today. We have Alex Berenson, the author of Tell Your Children, The Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence, with us today at a NotMYkid breakfast here in beautiful Arizona. Alex, welcome to the show.
Glenn, it's a pleasure to be here.
This book that I have before you, I'm the father of a 17, a 15, and a 10-year-old, three girls. This book is marked up by my wife, Tali. She commandeered this book, and it's been a big topic of dinner time conversation for the entire family.
Well, I hope the 10-year-old doesn't need to worry about this yet. There's unfortunately a lot of cannabis use, THC use, vaping among older teens, and that's a real problem.
We're obviously concerned having two teenage girls, and even today at breakfast, I wanted to brush up. You did a recent AEI podcast, and my 17-year-old was listening to it and asked me to forward it to her.
Sure. So I've done a bunch of media. I mean, one of the things about vaping, by the way, specifically for teens, is it's attractive to teenagers and to teenage girls, partly because it's more concealable than flower or cannabis. Also, it doesn't smell, so you don't stink of skunk. And I think to a lot of teenage girls, that's more appealing. And so use among girls is actually rising faster than use among boys.
Arizona did buck the national trend a few cycles ago when an opposition campaign really led by our governor, Governor Doug Ducey, and the business community, including the Arizona Chamber, fought back against a recreational marijuana effort. But can you talk a little bit about what the situation has been nationally?
Sure. So nationally, there is considerable support for legalizing cannabis. It's above 60% nationally. And if you look at why that is, it's actually very interesting. Most Americans don't use cannabis. Even now, despite the sort of growth in access, only about 15% of Americans used in 2018, and that number hasn't been rising that much. And there are a number of people who will try it and then only use it once or a handful of times because they don't like it, because they do feel the psychiatric effects and they don't like it. So what's really happening is people who don't use this drug have been really told, it's been a very sophisticated campaign that's decades long now, that to some extent has been aided and abetted by people in the media who, from my point of view, should know better, to tell them that this is essentially a harmless drug, that's actually safer than alcohol, that it has all these potential medicinal benefits. And so I think Americans are pretty fair-minded people, and if you don't use this, you don't know, and you get told enough times, hey, this is safe, you may decide, okay, I'm going to vote for legalization without knowing anything about it. I think, and I don't have good evidence about this, there's not great polling data on this, my sense is that support for legalization is a mile wide and an inch deep.
Well, one of the things after reading this book that became very clear to me is that the science is a lot more settled on this than you would believe reading stories of the mainstream media.
That's true. The science on the psychiatric harms is settled. We know that cannabis can cause episodes of psychosis. We know that it accelerates the development of schizophrenia and other psychotic illnesses, which are, sort of the most severe kinds of mental illness. We know that for people who have mental illness, if they're taking care of themselves and their condition is under control, if they start to use again, they're likely to relapse very quickly. I would say the only place where there is a debate, there's a legitimate debate, is whether heavy cannabis use or moderate cannabis use, even in some cases, can cause de novo cases of schizophrenia in people who wouldn't have otherwise developed it. I think there's quite a bit of evidence there. I would say there are reasonable people who think the science is not settled. So if you think about sort of tobacco and lung cancer, it took many years, it really took decades from the time that initial hypothesis was developed until it got to a place we could all agree. We're somewhere in the middle with cannabis and psychosis.
And one of the things that also comes up in the book that a lot of people don't aware, this is not the same marijuana as 30 or 40 years ago. There seems to be an arms race in terms of potency.
A great point. I think arms race is a great term. It really is true that 40 or 50 years ago, when cannabis first, sort of came to the notice of many Americans, it was very weak. It was actually called ditchweed a lot of the time. It was 1 or 2% THC. Now, THC is the chemical that has the psychoactive effects that get you stoned, and that also has the psychiatric harms. that has basically gone straight up, and then in the last few years, it's gone essentially parabolic, the curve. So when I was growing up, in the 80s and 90s, it was more of sort of a 3 to 5% cannabis THC in cannabis. In a way, it's actually a story of scientific success. These are very sophisticated farmers and scientists who've cloned. They've crossbred and cloned this very potent marijuana that's 10 to 20%, now 20 to 30% THC, but even that isn't good enough for a lot of people who are heavy users. And so what they use is a semi-synthetic product. It's called wax or shatter or honey oil, and that's basically extracted from the plant, and that's almost pure THC. And that appears to be much more psychiatrically harmful.
What are we seeing in all of these different states that have gone down legalization? Colorado, other states, in terms of what are we seeing? Traffic, health, education?
To me, this is fascinating. We're now 5 years in for recreational dispensaries opening in Colorado and Washington. Those are the first 2 states, and collectively, those are relatively, they're mid-sized states, but they have about 12, 13 million people, so not a small sample size. Psychiatric admission to ERs. We don't have statewide data because we have terrible data on mental health in the United States, but based on surveys of a couple large hospitals in Colorado, those numbers are way up. There's really nothing that's gone in a positive direction. What's very interesting is that pre-legalization, one of the big sales pitches for legalization is this is really going to reduce violent crime. This is going to help the police focus on violent criminals. They won't have to arrest people who are smoking a joint in the park. And by the way, I don't say, because we don't have proof that legalization is behind that increase. But what we can say with certainty is that the promise that legalization would somehow reduce crime has proven not to be the case at all.
Tax revenue?
Tax revenue, in Colorado and Washington, those states have actually done, I would say, okay on tax revenue. And by okay, I mean that in Colorado, which is the state that sort of has the biggest industry relative to population size, it's about 1% of the state budget. So you are not going to fix the schools crisis or anything else.
One of the things you say in the book, it's not great to use it at any time, but if you're going to use delay, you do not want to use this as a teenager.
Yes.
Period. What are we seeing academically or just?
So one interesting thing is that it doesn't appear that teen use has actually risen that much in Colorado. By teen, I mean 12 to 17, not young adult use. Young adult use in Colorado and Washington is up significantly. Those states have very high levels of young adult use, and it's risen. As for teen use, for whatever reason, use hasn't risen very much. That's probably the one positive thing you can say post-legal. Not that it's just not a negative. When you talk to legalizers, the one thing they'll say over and over again is, well, teen use hasn't risen. Look at that. It's like, okay, that's nice, and that appears to be true based on the best data that I've seen. Again, we're talking 12 to 17, not young adult, and everything else is wrong. So if I'm going to acknowledge to you, hey, you're right about this, it'd be nice if you acknowledged to me everything else.
Final question. You're about ready to go into a ballroom with hundreds of business leaders, community leaders, and parents. What's the message that you're going to deliver to them?
The message I'm going to deliver is when you tell people the truth about the psychiatric harms, and I actually saw this Tuesday night at a debate I had in Laredo, when you tell people the truth about what's happened with violence in the legalized states, when you tell people the truth about how relatively small an industry this is, their views on legalization change. Look, there are arguments for legalization, but for the most part, those arguments have been made in a vacuum with no arguments against being heard. And when people hear this stuff, they're pretty surprised by it, and oftentimes they will reconsider. So the important thing is to get the facts out there. And really, the reason that I came to this was because I viewed it as a failure of journalism. That there is all this science, there is all this important fact, important data that people need to know, and that's the key. Get the truth out.
My final question, New York Times reporter, you've had pieces in the Wall Street Journal, just how the mainstream media has covered your incredibly important book overall.
Well, so they've allowed me to put my head in the noose and say, this is what I think. I really wish the book had gotten more neutral review attention. And honestly, to me, if I were a magazine writer, I think the story of a Times journalist turned novelist who wrote this book because his wife told him to would be an interesting profile, but nobody seems to agree.
I agree. And Alex, thank you very much for being on the show, and I look forward to hearing your remarks in a few minutes.
Great. Glenn, thank you very much.
Thank you.